It was time to upgrade from my RTX 3070. I felt that it was underperforming a little bit at 1440p. So I got the RX 9070 XT thinking it would be a massive upgrade. But how is the performance in comparison to my RTX 3070, and have I made a good purchasing decision? Let's go ahead and find out. For our two graphics cards, we are using the ASRock RX 9070 XT Tai-Chi OC and the Zotac RTX 3070 Twin Edge LHR. The RX 9070 XT Tai-Chi is on RDNA 4 of course, with a TDP of 304 watts. It has a base clock of 1870 MHz and a boost clock of 31 MHz. It's on PCIe 5.0. Mine is a triple slot design and has 16GB of GDDR6 for VRAM, and its memory bus is 256-bit. For my RTX 3070, it's on the Ampere architecture, has a TDP of 220 watts, a base clock of 1500 MHz, a boost clock of 1725 MHz, and is on PCIe 4.0. Mine is a dual slot design and has 8GB of GDDR6 for VRAM. Its memory bus is 256-bit as well. For our system specs, I'll be using the Ryzen 7 7800X3D with PBO. We have an Arctic Liquid Freezer 3 on top of it. For the GPUs, we'll have the Zotac RTX 3070 and the ASRock RX 9070 XT Tai-Chi. Both are going to be stock. For RAM, we have 32GB of G.Skill DDR5 6000 CL30. Our motherboard is an ASRock X870E Tai-Chi Lite, and we have rebar enabled. We'll be on Windows 10 and with the latest NVIDIA and AMD drivers as of filming. All games are tested on a 3-run average. Games are tested in full screen with VSync off. Low latency mode is off, rebar is on, DLSS and FSR is on when specified. It will be in the graph title, and we're using the latest NVIDIA and AMD drivers as well as Windows 10 to test everything. For the structure of this video, I have 21 games for you guys to see at 1080p and 1440p. I also have 4 games for ray tracing. After, I will have a overall comparison for percentage difference between the cards and resolutions, and a price comparison and some final thoughts at the end. Let's head on to the benchmarks. For our first game, we have a Plague Tale Requiem, and at 1080p, the RTX 3070 managed to achieve 87 FPS on average and 52 for 1% lows, while the RX 9070 XT reached a massive 155 average FPS for 1080p and 87 for 1% lows. And at 1440p, there is a percentage difference of 70% between the two cards at average FPS and 65% at 1% lows. I didn't have any problems at 1080p, but at 1440p, the RTX 3070 did start to struggle a little bit for me, and the frame times weren't as smooth as they were on 1080p. Next up, we have Alan Wake 2 on high settings, and this is where the RTX 3070 definitely started to struggle a bit. We achieved only 60 FPS on average, and the 1% lows were 49. Compared that at 1440p, we got 44 for average FPS and 37 for 1% lows. I wouldn't say it was the best of experience at 1440p. 1080p was definitely playable, but the RTX 3070 is definitely starting to show its limits here. I was quite surprised at the RX 9070 XT's performance, as on 1080p it achieved 120 FPS on average, and on 1% lows it achieved 90, whereas at 1440p it drops to 72 for average FPS and 57 for 1% lows. A bit of a drop at 1440p, but this is Alan Wake 2 of course, so it is a little bit more difficult to run. Next up, we have Avatar Frontiers of Pandora on ultra settings with TAA native. I am using the in-game benchmark for this benchmark. At 1080p, the RX 9070 XT showed a massive difference between it and the RTX 3070, delivering a 70% higher average FPS and a 62% better 1% lows. I felt that the RTX 3070 delivered a similar performance even compared to Alan Wake 2, which is interesting as these games are a little bit more difficult to run. As you can see on the 1440p result, we were only averaging 45 FPS, and for 1% lows it was 36. So not that great of a result here, but at least on 1080p it's a smooth result for both graphics cards. Our next game is Black Myth Wukong, running on the very high settings with TSR 100%. I am using the benchmark tool for this game, so just keep that in mind. This was pretty difficult for the RTX 3070, as we can see here. Average FPS on 1080p was 40, and on 1440p it was 29. The 1% lows at 1080p with 34, and as you can see it took quite a hit at 1440p, dropping down to 25. At 1080p, between the RTX 3070 and the RX 9070 XT, there was a difference in average FPS of 35, and at 1440p of 29. So still quite a difference and a big uplift from the RX 9070 XT, and we can definitely see that the RTX 3070 here really struggled, and honestly I wouldn't exactly call this a very playable experience at 1440p at all. It looked quite cinematic unfortunately, which is not a good thing, especially in a game. Our next title is Call of Duty Black Ops 6 using the Extreme preset and the in-game benchmark. The RTX 3070 here struggled to even get above 100 FPS on 1080p, and on 1440p we still don't fare very well at 68 FPS. Now of course the RX 9070 XT had significant uplifts over the RTX 3070 here, almost reaching 200 FPS on average FPS at 1080p. Really good result for the RX 9070 XT here. The next game we have is Clair Obscur Expedition 33 on epic settings at TAA native. Now you can see both cards here kind of struggled a little bit to run the game, as it's really new and looks visually stunning in my opinion. At 1080p, the RX 9070 XT was 66% faster on average FPS, and for the 1% lows was 72% faster. At 1440p, there is a 55% percentage difference between the two graphics cards on average FPS, and a 72% difference on 1% lows. Now I will say, with the RTX 3070 on 1440p, with native resolution, raster performance did not feel very good to run at all. The 32 FPS on 1440p just felt really unpleasant, and especially dropping down to 23 as well was not fun at all. Now do keep in mind the game does run pretty well with DLSS enabled, so that is the saving grace for the RTX 3070 here. Our next game is Counter-Strike 2. We are using the very high preset as well, and I'm in a Dust 2 deathmatch. We can see here that both the RTX 3070 and RX 9070 XT at 1080p performed very well. Now, of course, you could drop your settings slightly if you need to get past that 300 FPS threshold if you need for high refresh gaming. You can see the RX 9070 XT had no problem achieving this at 1080p, and the RTX 3070 came pretty close as well. At 1440p, we dropped slightly to 195 FPS for the RTX 3070, and 261 FPS on average for the RX 9070 XT. As I expected, no real problems here in terms of running Counter-Strike 2. Our next title is Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty. The RTX 3070 achieved 86 FPS on average, and the 1% lows was 67. This was on 1080p. Whereas the RX 9070 XT achieved 153 FPS and 115 for 1% lows. So this is quite a difference between the two, being a percentage difference of 56% for average FPS and 53% for 1% lows. At 1440p, we find that there is a 62% difference on average FPS and a 30% difference on 1% lows. I'd say both graphics cards performed pretty well on both 1080p and 1440p. It's just a little bit disappointing that the RTX 3070 could only achieve 56 FPS on average at 1440p. Definitely not unplayable, but I would have liked to see a little bit more. Next, we have one of our newer games being Doom the Dark Ages. I was running the game at Ultra Nightmare settings with TAA native, and I had to increase the texture pool size to 4096. Disappointingly, but I guess not surprisingly, the RTX 3070 did struggle in this title quite a bit. You can see at 1080p, it only achieved 43 FPS on average, and its 1% lows were 28. Not the smoothest experience, especially because you're in combat all the time. Between the RTX 3070 and RX 9070 XT, there was a 93% difference at 1080p, and its 1% lows was 108% difference. Now, of course, there is a significant uplift for the RX 9070 XT, as I would have expected. We can see 1440p, disappointingly, we only achieved 21 FPS on average and 15 for 1% lows. To be perfectly honest with you guys, this was not a playable or enjoyable experience. Now, of course, you can lower your settings and turn on DLSS, but unfortunately for its raster settings at Ultra Nightmare settings, it really wasn't a good experience at all. The RX 9070 XT managed to get 87 FPS on average, and its 1% lows was 69 for 1440p. Next up is F124. Now, I'm glad to say for F124, using ultra high settings and TAA native, we saw that the RTX 3070 actually had a very playable frame rate at 1080p and 1440p respectively. At 1080p, there was a 65% percentage difference between the two cards on average FPS, and its 1% lows percentage difference was 72%. Whereas on 1440p, it was a 66% difference on average FPS and 57% percentage difference for 1% lows at 1440p. I was pretty happy with how this game ran on both cards, but we can see clearly that the RX 9070 XT is capable of that high refresh rate. Our next title is Fortnite on DX12. Now, we won't be using competitive esports settings for either of these cards, instead using the Epic settings, so please keep that in mind. At 1080p, the RX 9070 XT achieved a average FPS of 125, and for 1% lows it achieved 58. The RTX 3070 achieved an average FPS of 79, and its 1% lows were 52, which was actually kind of comparable to the RX 9070 XT. Both provided a very playable experience and didn't have any problems with frame time. At 1440p, we find that the RTX 3070 was 41% slower than the RX 9070 XT on average FPS and 31% slower on 1% lows. Not too bad for either one of these cards in Fortnite. In Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced version, I am not using the in-game benchmark and instead using the single player benchmark on this road on the map. I am also using the maximum ray trace quality settings, but with no frame scaling. Surprisingly, the RTX 3070 actually managed to outperform the RX 9070 XT on 1080p results, as its average FPS was 149 compared to the RX 9070 XT's 140. This was a percentage difference of 6%. The 1% lows difference at 1080p is a percentage difference of 9% in favor of the RTX 3070. Now, I did rerun this test a couple of times just to make sure that this is correct, and yes, the RTX 3070 did outperform a RX 9070 XT at 1080p. On 1440p, this is pretty much the story of what should happen. The RTX 3070 performed worse than the RX 9070 XT, being a percentage difference in favor of the 9070 XT of 44% on average FPS and 41% on 1% lows. I do want to do some tests in the future to check what's actually making the 1080p result in favor of the RTX 3070. Our next title is Hogwarts Legacy, running on the Ultra preset. We did run into some issues with this title on Hogwarts Legacy in terms of 1% lows for the RX 9070 XT. You can see at 1080p, the RTX 3070 actually managed to achieve a slightly better 1% lows. But in terms of average FPS, the RTX 3070 was 25% slower on average FPS at 1080p. And we find at 1440p, it was 40% slower, and the 1% lows were exactly the same. An interesting result for the RTX 3070 here, but I think Hogwarts Legacy might require some more retesting in the future for my RX 9070 XT. Next up is Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered, and I'm using the in-game benchmark on very high settings with TAA native. At 1080p, the RTX 3070 managed to achieve an average FPS of 97 and an abysmal 11 FPS for 1% lows. Now unfortunately, on this benchmark, the RTX 3070 really couldn't handle the game. There's some parts of the game where it just stutters to oblivion and it feels completely unresponsive. It lags and the frame times are terrible in some sections, but a lot of the other sections are smoother. I have tested this multiple times just to make sure that it is correct, and yes, my RTX 3070 in this benchmark really can't handle some sections of the map. On the other hand, the RX 9070 XT was pretty good at 1080p and 1440p, achieving 177 average FPS on 1080p and 154 average FPS for 1440p. So we have significant uplifts over the RTX 3070, and we had a very stable, smooth frame rate. Our next title is Marvel Rivals on the Ultra preset with TAAU 100%. On 1080p, on average FPS, there was a percentage difference between the two cards of 49%, and for the 1% lows at 1080p, it was 39%. We can see that the RTX 3070 still delivers a playable frame rate even with the ultra settings at 1080p, but do keep in mind I am saying playable with quotations because I know at 60 FPS on Marvel Rivals it doesn't feel too good, especially in larger fights. At 1440p, we find that the RX 9070 XT was able to achieve 83 FPS on average and 55 FPS for 1% lows, whereas the RTX 3070 was on 48 FPS for average FPS and 30 FPS for 1% lows. I can personally say as well from experience, the RTX 3070 does struggle on 1440p, playing many other games on Marvel Rivals at that resolution. It really kind of reaches its maximum at 1080p, and 1440p is really pushing it, even if we lower the quality settings. Moving on to Ratchet and Clank A Rift Apart with very high settings and TAA native, we find that 1080p, we had a more than playable experience on both the RTX 3070 and the RX 9070 XT. The RTX 3070 achieving 90 FPS on average and 56 FPS for 1% lows. At 1440p, we still have a very playable experience from the RTX 3070, achieving 73 FPS on average and 47 for 1% lows. Between the two cards, at 1440p, there was a 60% percentage difference on average FPS and a 71 percentage difference on 1% lows. Great outcome from both cards, and I'm really happy to see that it's more than playable even with the highest settings on 1440p for the RTX 3070. Now we're testing Spider Man Remastered with very high settings and TAA native. I found that Spider Man Remastered played really well on both cards, achieving very smooth frame times and having no problems at 1080p. On 1440p, we have a little bit of a different story. Although the RTX 3070 is achieving an average FPS of 121, there was some places where it did hiccup a little bit, dropping its 1% lows to 57, which is a little bit disappointing. Overall though, both cards performed pretty well, and I'm still happy with the RTX 3070 results overall. Okay, now we got S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2. We're running this on epic settings, TAA native, but the RTX 3070 bombed out here. It wasn't able to handle this game at all on its highest settings without a form of upscaling. So for this title at 1080p and 1440p, I will be using the DLSS quality settings for the RTX 3070. Running the game without upscaling, I was only getting between around about 3 and 5 FPS, so I just cancelled the run. It was almost impossible to play the game at all. So we can see here that the RX 9070 XT did manage to achieve a basically similar frame rate at 1440p and 1080p, and the RTX 3070 with DLSS quality settings managed to put around about 52 FPS on average for 1080p and 48 average FPS for 1440p. Not too bad a result, but at least we can play with some upscaling involved. Let's take a look at Star Wars Jedi Survivor. At 1080p, I was more than pleased with the result from the RTX 3070, achieving 95 FPS on average and 74 for its 1% lows. In comparison to its RX 9070 XT competitor, we have 146 for average FPS and 98 for 1% lows. Both very good results. At 1440p, we dropped that result down to 48 average FPS and 34 1% lows for the RTX 3070. At 1440p, this was a percentage difference of 74% on average FPS and an 81% difference on 1% lows. Now we're testing The Last of Us Part 1 on ultra settings. The RTX 3070 achieved an average FPS of 76 and 65 for 1% lows at 1080p. In contrast to the RX 9070 XT, this was a loss of 60 FPS for average FPS and a loss of 47 FPS for 1% lows. We can see at 1440p the RTX 3070 didn't fare too well, and although it was a playable experience to a certain extent, it was not the most enjoyable. At 41 FPS for average FPS and 31 for 1% lows, it wasn't the best experience in my personal opinion. Between the two cards at 1440p, this was a difference of 88% for average FPS and a difference of 97% for 1% lows. Moving on to our last game, which is Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. We're using ultra settings and TAA native here. At 1080p, there was a small percentage difference between the two cards, being only 12% on average FPS and 7% for the 1% lows at 1080p. At 1440p, this difference grows a lot larger, being a 49% difference on average FPS and 48% on 1% lows. It's clear to me that in newer titles, the RTX 3070 is definitely struggling at 1440p, and could be due to the fact that it only has 8GB of VRAM available for it. Now we're going to have a look at percentage difference graphs. Starting us off, we have average FPS percentage difference at 1080p between the RX 9070 XT and the RTX 3070. The higher the percentage difference, the better it is for the RX 9070 XT. The lower it is, so if it's negative, the better it is for the RTX 3070. Although there are 21 games that we did benchmark, please keep in mind that since S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 was using DLSS settings for the RTX 3070, I won't be including it in the overall percentage difference between the two graphics cards. As you can see in the top left, it says 20 games instead of 21. So for 1080p, we can clearly see that the RX 9070 XT was 45% faster on average at 1080p for these 20 games. A significant outlier here is Doom: The Dark Ages, with a 93% percentage difference between it and the RTX 3070. The other outlier is Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced, and unfortunately the RX 9070 XT was beaten out by a 6% percentage difference to the RTX 3070. As I mentioned, I might need to do some retesting with this game, but I did do multiple runs to try and check if this is correct, and it was. Overall, we have a nice uplift over the RTX 3070, and it looks to be a good thing going forward for the RX 9070 XT. On our 1% lows, we have a little bit of a different story at 1080p. The RX 9070 XT was only 41% faster on average at 1080p for these 20 games. The first outlier here, of course, is Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered. This title just did not play very nicely on the RTX 3070 at all. So we have an 165% percentage difference on the 1% lows. On the other hand, we had 3 titles that went in favor of the RTX 3070, being GTA 5 Enhanced, Counter-Strike 2, and Hogwarts Legacy, with Hogwarts Legacy being the largest percentage difference of 44% percentage difference in favor of the RTX 3070. Bit of an interesting result here, but I guess it's not too bad for the RX 9070 XT here. We might need to do some retesting with those 3 games, but I think it's okay for now. Moving on to 1440p for average FPS, we can see that the RX 9070 XT was a lot faster than the RTX 3070, being 59% faster on average at 1440p for these 20 games. None of these games swung in the favor of the RTX 3070, which is great to see, but I guess at 1440p, the RTX 3070 is kind of going to be stretched to its absolute limits here. For the 1% lows, we can see it was 61% faster on average at 1440p for these 20 games for the RX 9070 XT. The only game here that didn't perform in the RX 9070 XT's favor was Hogwarts Legacy at a 0% difference between it and the RTX 3070. I guess a lot of these games did perform really well at 1440p, showing that the RX 9070 XT, of course, as we all know, should perform much better than the RTX 3070, even in these 1% lows. Just quickly as well, I'll put the 1080p 20 game average here. Of course, it excludes S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2, so we can see that the RX 9070 got a total of 151 FPS over the 20 games and 96 for 1% lows, whereas the RTX 3070 got 96 for average FPS and 63 for 1% lows. At 1440p, we follow a similar trend again, 120 FPS for average FPS on the RX 9070 XT and 83 for 1% lows. The RTX 3070 is 66 for average FPS and 44 for 1% lows. Now the graph is looking a little bit bare here, as these are the first two cards that I've tested with these 20 games, and it will start to fill up as I test more cards, so hopefully we get a nice full graph over time. We're going to be having a look at the ray trace games. Now I only have 4 for you guys, and I will be testing them all at 1080p because the RTX 3070 just doesn't really handle ray tracing that well anyways, so I don't think 1440p would be very fair for it. Let's start off with Alan Wake 2 on 1080p using the high preset with ray tracing on high, using quality upscaling. The RX 9070 XT achieved an average FPS of 50 and 1% lows of 41. The RTX 3070 achieved an average FPS of 31 and a 1% lows of 24. You can see at average FPS this was a percentage difference of 47 and a percentage difference of 52% on the 1% lows. So quite a big uplift here, although still not the best on the RX 9070 XT. Next up, we have Black Myth Wukong with very high settings on ray trace very high. We had the screen resolution on 100% as well. We can see here that there was a 97% percentage difference on average FPS and 1% lows between the RTX 3070 and the RX 9070 XT. To be perfectly honest with you guys, the RTX 3070 just was not that playable with these settings on this benchmark tool. The game unfortunately looked cinematic, which was not a good thing, and having a 1% lows of 15 felt terrible when looking at this gameplay. Our next game is Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty with the Ultra preset, ray tracing on Ultra, upscaling quality with the transformer model for ray tracing, and path tracing is off. The RTX 3070 here didn't do too bad. The average FPS was 53 and the 1% lows was 34. Now I did encounter some stutter with the RTX 3070 on the ray trace setting, so I might need to retest this in the future. On average FPS, there was a 62% percentage difference between the RTX 3070 and RX 9070 XT on average FPS, and a difference of 47 FPS on 1% lows. So quite a significant uplift here for Cyberpunk 2077 and the RX 9070 XT actually reaching triple digits. Lastly, we have Spider Man Remastered with very high settings, ray trace on very high, and upscaling on quality setting. We can see here that the RTX 3070 actually performed really well in this title, so there wasn't too much of a difference between it and the RX 9070 XT. The RX 9070 XT got 123 FPS for average FPS and 88 for 1% lows, whereas the RTX 3070 got 119 for average FPS and 73 for 1% lows. Very good, and there was only a 4 FPS difference on average FPS and a 15 FPS difference on 1% lows. Performing pretty well on this title, I'm very happy with that. When we have a look at all 4 games for the ray trace titles, we find that the RX 9070 XT is 39% faster on average for these 4 games. The significant outliers here are Black Myth Wukong with a 97% difference for average FPS, and Spider Man Remastered on a 3% difference for average FPS. Quite a significant uplift over the RTX 3070 for these 4 ray trace titles. When we have a look at the 1% lows, we are 54% faster on average for these 4 ray trace titles, and Spider Man Remastered goes up to a percentage difference of 19%, and of course Black Myth Wukong with the 97% percentage difference. Pretty happy with the RX 9070 XT's results here, and that it provides an upgrade even with ray tracing over the RTX 3070. Let's take a quick look at some current pricing. Just keep in mind I have the US dollar pricing and the New Zealand dollar pricing as well on the graph. I am using the 5 cheapest listings from each of these places, so PB is a New Zealand retailer. Newegg I've used for the online retailer, and I set the shipping location to the United States. TradeMe is basically New Zealand's eBay, and then actual eBay I've set the shipping location to the United States. Only the New Zealand retailer PB has the GST or VAT included in its price, and the card has to be in stock as well. So you can see in New Zealand we're paying quite a bit more compared to something like Newegg for the rest of the world. So we're paying $935 on average compared to the Newegg's $837. It seems like the price for the RX 9070 XT overall though, even on Newegg, isn't really that close to the MSRP anymore and is quite expensive, at least for the cards that were in stock. For the RTX 3070, we can see that TradeMe New Zealand had an average price of $373, although there are multiple listings for an RTX 3070 that were mined on from the same seller for under this price. And anecdotally as well, I have seen multiple auctions for going less than $373, probably more closer to the eBay $271 mark. On eBay, you can see that we're paying $271 on average for the RTX 3070, and overall, comparing the two cards, I mean, that's not exactly fair, but the RX 9070 XT is quite expensive at the moment, and that's a trend that's pretty common in a lot of regions at the moment. I don't know if I mentioned this in the video just yet, but I know in a couple of regions, like in Australia, the RTX 5070 Ti, at least some of the models, are actually less than the RX 9070 XT. So a little bit concerning for pricing on the RX 9070 XT going forward, but we'll see how trends play out. Let's take a look at cost per frame data based on the pricing that we saw just before, and at 1080p we'll be doing the 20 game average. We'll be excluding S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 because that game didn't run without DLSS on the RTX 3070. So of course a lower price is better here, and let's start out with the RX 9070 XT. So we can see in New Zealand that you're paying slightly more compared to the rest of the world in cost per frame. In New Zealand it's $6.20 US, and on Newegg it was $5.55 US. Now, funnily enough, since the price between the cards are so dramatic, we can see that the RTX 3070 actually beats out the RX 9070 XT in terms of cost per frame, just because the price difference is so large. So on TradeMe New Zealand, it comes out to $3.90 US, and on eBay it comes down to $2.83 US. So you can see there's a significant difference between the two cards. Of course, we're comparing a brand new price to a second-hand price, so please do keep that in mind. Take this with a little bit of a grain of salt when you're reading this graph. Similar thing goes at 1440p as well. We can see that in New Zealand, you're paying $7.76 US dollars for cost per frame compared to Newegg's pricing of $6.95 US dollars. Now the gap actually closes a little bit more at 1440p between the RTX 3070 and RX 9070 XT, and of course this is because the RTX 3070 struggles a little bit more at 1440p. So we can see in TradeMe we've gone up to a price of $5.68 US dollars, and on eBay it's up to $4.12 US. So clearly comparing that to the 1080p graph, of course the gap starts to close, and I suspect as well on 4K as well will close the gap even more. But I think this goes to show as well that the RX 9070 XT is a little bit expensive at the moment. However, at the same time, if you are waiting to upgrade and in your region there are no other cards at that price level, it can be a good buy, just like it was for me. I'll expand on this just now in my final thoughts. I'm pretty happy with the uplift in performance that the RX 9070 XT provides over the RTX 3070. Everything feels clean and fluid in the majority of games from the RX 9070 XT. Now of course, we probably all knew this already, but it's good to find out how much better the RX 9070 XT is over something like the RTX 3070, which has a limited 8GB of VRAM. For the RTX 3070, it can still be a good buy in 2025 secondhand at the right price. It's clear to me that the RTX 3070 is struggling in newer games and will continue to struggle going forward, especially at 1440p with no upscaling. I mean, even at 1080p, DLSS is the saving grace for the RTX 3070 in many scenarios. For example, in Clair Obscur Expedition 33, it feels alright, but the FPS output is relatively low, but when we're using quality upscaling on DLSS, the game feels much better. Even Stalker 2 would just not run because of the VRAM usage, and its FPS was between 3 and 5 without DLSS upscaling, even at 1080p. It's not that this card is bad in performance, it's just that you'll have to temper your expectations, especially when it comes to newer games, on how it's going to run. It also really depends how much you're willing to buy this card for. At the moment, we are in an odd place with GPUs around the world. The RX 9070 XT is shaping up to be more expensive than people hoped, and in some regions, some of the models of the RTX 5070 Ti are actually cheaper than the RX 9070 XT. While the RX 9070 XT is a great upgrade, it depends on how much you're willing to pay for it. For myself, I got my RX 9070 XT ASRock Tai-Chi model for 1,483 New Zealand dollars, which is 895 US dollars. This is significantly over MSRP, but in New Zealand, the cheapest RTX 5070 Ti starts at 1,799 New Zealand dollars, which is 1,086 US dollars, which was really over my budget. This is not excusing the RX 9070 XT's price, as my Tai-Chi model is now 1,519 New Zealand dollars or 917 US dollars. A small increase, but an increase nonetheless. In New Zealand, I've seen models of the RX 9070 XT rise dramatically in price, such as the Sapphire Nitro, from around about 1,520 New Zealand dollars to 1,649 New Zealand dollars, which erodes the value of the card completely. At the end of the day, it depends on your region. If the RTX 5070 Ti is cheaper than the RX 9070 XT, I'd personally get the 5070 Ti, but if it's not, like for me, get the 9070 XT. The RTX 3070 is still a capable card, particularly at 1080p. Take a look at the video I put out earlier this year on benchmarking the RTX 3070, which focused on slightly older titles, and the card was generally okay. But still, in newer games and going forward, the 8GB of VRAM is going to be an issue. So, putting it simply, do you play older games and esport titles mainly at 1080p? Yes? Then stick to the RTX 3070. Do you want to play the latest titles on their highest quality settings? Yes? Then it might be time to upgrade. Lastly, do you want a solid 1080p card for under 450 New Zealand dollars or 271 US dollars secondhand with no other options available? Yes, the RTX 3070 could be a good buy. That's kind of my way of summing it up, and to see if you really want to upgrade from the RTX 3070 or not. I'd really like to compare the RTX 3070 to the RX 6700 XT, which has 12GB of VRAM, to see the difference. If you'd like to see me make that video, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Comment down below if you're thinking of upgrading from your RTX 3070 or any other GPU. Check out wisetech.org for some more awesome content, but other than that, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!